every time we are on a lecture, I have my students always coming and pointing out the mere reality, because I'm sure you're all familiar that when you are talking about international relations, we're talking about a lot of concepts. We're talking a lot of theory. But theory doesn't match the reality. It's actually very poor in comparison to reality. So my latest experiences have made me wonder how I can discuss this topic of international relations in a more appropriate to reality manner. So that's why the title of my presentation, Sense and Sensibility in Contemporary IR. Because what I'm going to talk today refers to how our senses, our individual senses, even if we are in a decision-making position or as a mere student, influence the way we look at the reality surrounding us and also influence the reality that surrounds us. So this is what my students face whenever I'm teaching theory, and we're talking about concepts and ideas and theories and, you know, realism, idealism, structuralism, and so on. And I just gave you a few examples on how theory is not matched by reality. And the first is the Geneva Convention system, the 4 Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols that I refer to when going into further acknowledgement of how the international system evolved. And these Geneva Conventions actually refer to how wars should be fought and what is the do's and don'ts in a war, what is appropriate, how you should treat prisoners of war, how the population should not be affected by the war, and so on. This is very nice when you look at it on the paper. However, my students always come and say, but you know, look on the news, the war in Ukraine is kicking this Geneva Convention system. It's not respecting anything of this Geneva Convention system. And what do I say to them? Of course, you're right, because this is the reality. I'm supposed to give you the regulations. But the reality does not always, in most cases, follow the regulations. The second is multilateralism. It's a very nice concept, a very attractive one. It actually has a nice ring about it, multilateralism. But after Ukraine, after 24th of February 2022, everyone is saying multilateralism is dead. Multilateral organizations have failed in protecting Ukraine and protecting the world from a war, a traditional war that everyone thought is back in time. It ended with the Second World War, and we are no longer going to hear about tanks and conventional weaponry and so on. But Ukraine proved us wrong again. The third example, there are so many examples, but I only have 15 minutes time to talk, so I'd rather stick to my 3 examples. The UN, the collective security system, that has proven to be, again, ineffective because the aggressor is part of the permanent members. And it's a funny story here. One of my students is it's a second-year student, and he's very passionate. And every time he comes in with his own opinion, and he starts like this. If I were in a position to kick Russia out, I would do it without even thinking. And I'm the bad guy, and I'm saying, you can't do it. You're not allowed to do it. The system doesn't allow you to do it. And he always asks, but why not? How can the system be changed? And of course, the discussion is very long, and I start saying, you know, the charter that was signed by the previous members, it was also signed by the remaining up to 193 members. You have to reform the charter, and then you have to have all these 192, if you kick Russia out, 92 members to agree and, you know, collide all their opinions. So, and he's always disappointed. You know, he's from this very eager phase, like, I'm going to kick Russia out, and he's like, that's not good. And unfortunately, I cannot give more solutions. So, going further, first of all, that was my background, you know, the fundament of my talk. Now, the title deals with sense and sensibility, and you probably wonder, what does Jane Austen have to do with contemporary IR? What does this nice lady who wrote back in the early 19th century 6 novels, mostly dealing with the troubles that women of the 19th century dealt with in love and other affairs, what does she have to do with contemporary IR? And the answer, of course, she doesn't have anything to do with it. But the title of her novel, Sense and Sensibility, actually put me to thinking on how much our decisions if we take them as decision makers, or if we take them as mere individuals, are influenced, are actually puzzled between should it be a sensible one or should it be a sensitive one. In most cases, irrespective of the decision-making position or not, they're all sensitive decisions. They're all sensitive options because, you know, the heart takes over the cerebral point of a manner of thinking. So this took me to the topic of my discussion today, because we are experiencing the world around us and international relations altogether based on our senses. And I'm giving you a picture here. It's not very visible. It's a picture of a Pietro Paolini. He's a 17th century Italian painter who studied the technique of Caravaggio and tried to replicate it. And this is called an allegory of senses. If you look the title up, you will find several other pictures with the same name, because the topic of senses being represented in painting was very common throughout time. And I'm sorry you cannot see it very well, but the image is of a man. The man on the left is drinking, so that's experiencing taste. The woman is playing the guitar, so that's hearing. We also have someone smelling on the right, that's smell. There's a man with the glasses, that's vision, and there's some other people in the background fighting, that's touch. So all the five senses are represented in this painting. And actually, this allegory of senses is actually a representation of today's international community. Everyone is using their senses, metaphorically or not, because we will see in some cases, for instance, if we're talking about smell and taste, you can refer to them metaphorically. For the rest, you can actually refer them on a real-time basis. So everyone is experiencing the world around them based on their senses. And I went further and tried to dabble with these senses. So my first affirmation is what you see depends on where you sit. Actually, Albert Einstein said what you see depends on where you stand, but that's how I learned it on my first year as a student during my Bachelor of International Relations. And the picture is from the Vietnam War. It was taken from the many pictures available on the Vietnam War. Why the Vietnam War? Because it was the first televised war with embedded journalists on the field. It was the first time that you had war journalists embedded with the troops, and they reported not exactly live, but the information they depicted was first-hand. They tagged along the troops. They were trained to be able to survive so that they wouldn't become a burden for the troops, but they tagged along, they participated, they saw, and they relayed everything back home so that everyone at home was right aware on what's happening on the front. They saw exactly what was happening with their children, their brothers, sisters, fathers, friends, etc. And what was supposed to be another victory for the US actually became a televised failure, because we know that the war in Vietnam was one of the great failures of American military. But this takes me back to what you see depends on where you sit. Because everyone at home was expecting something grand. You know, the Americans, when they went to Vietnam, they were packed with so much equipment. They were wearing 20 kilos backpacks with equipment, weaponry, and so on. They were actually butchered by Vietnamese peasants who had machetes. And they had the advantage of the field, whereas the Americans did not know the field. But this was not relayed in the media, because again, it would contribute to the great failure that the war was. So people at home saw and were puzzled to see, actually, that their troops were being butchered and they couldn't find an explanation. Whereas the journalists on the field, they had the explanation at hand. But given that you are part of the service, you're supposed to relay the politically correct, let's call them, news, they couldn't place the finger on the issue at hand, that there was a disbalance between the area and the equipment, the training, and of course the will, because the Vietnamese had nothing else to lose. So they used all their forces, all their resources, all their ingenuity to fight back. So what you see actually depends on where you sit. Now, if we go to another crisis, what is happening in Ukraine? I come from Romania, so you can imagine the vicinity has been a great problem for us. And once the war in Ukraine broke out, there were two sides in the media. There were people who are saying that Ukraine and the invasion in Ukraine is just another Georgia of 2008. It will take place for 2 days and everything will go back to normal. There were people on the other side who were scared because we share a border with Ukraine. There was the implication of the war that everyone feared. Of course, we're a NATO member country. This membership kicked in and we sort of relaxed a bit, but still there was the pressure. We also had the historical background. We had the Red Army on our territory during the Cold War for some years. The elder members of the society still have the left traumas of dealing with the Russians. If you ask our grandparents, for instance, some of them still alive who fought during the Second World War, they would relate horrible experiences in dealing with the Russian troops. So the way we looked at the war, the way actually took aside any other point of interest for us. Because if we go back in time, for instance, starting 2020 when the pandemic broke out, all the attention was focused on the pandemic. Then the war came and no more stories about the pandemic featured in the news, just somewhere in the sidelines, and eventually they were totally taken off the table because the war was a more pressing issue. So for us, being in the vicinity actually carved the way we looked at the crisis. For others, if you look at Spain or Portugal or even the US, they are a bit further. If you ask the general individual, the regular individual on the street about the conflict in Ukraine, they will probably not manifest the same interest. Of course, they won't have the same fear of what is happening. But if you ask people in the eastern and southeastern part of Europe, Ukraine is a big issue, and the vicinity, the impact of this vicinity actually, because we can be neighbors and we cannot even share interests, but the impact that this vicinity has, the implications of this vicinity actually carve the way we look at the conflict. What you understand now depends on what you hear. And I've given you here two pictures. One is the picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt on his fireside chat radio broadcast with the NBC. His popularity actually grew during the 1930s, when he started this series. It's a series of talks that he delivered on the radio, on the NBC radio, where he discussed the major topics at the moment. He discussed about the impact of the Great Depression. He discussed about the Emergency Banking Act. He discussed about any other measures taken to improve the state and help the state recover. And in the 1930s, television was not something widespread in the US. Not everyone had a TV, but almost everyone had a radio. So it was the manner in which Franklin Roosevelt entered the houses of millions of Americans, related to them, and broke the barrier between the head of state, which is somehow up on a pedestal, and the regular individual who, in most cases, never has an interaction with the head of state directly. This was the manner of creating a direct interaction with the individual. And there are studies saying that his popularity grew a lot because of these fireside chat shows, but also he found a way to answering all the asked questions of the regular American, because at the time people were struggling, they were recovering from the economic failure of 1929, and they were furious. You know, any crisis turns the individual, the regular individual, furious against the decision maker, against the members of the state. It's somehow a very normal reaction, because every time something bad happens, we are humans, we're trying to put the blame on someone else. And in that case, people were furious, they were looking for answers, they wanted to know why the state could not protect them, the great state that was the United States of America. And this fireside chat actually found a way. I wouldn't be too optimistic and to say that it was a way to the regular American heart, but it found a way in the American society. It found a way of dialogue, of answering questions, of providing answers to questions that many could not put directly to the decision maker. The second image refers again to what you understand depends on what you hear. It's actually the presentation of a movie I'm sure you're all familiar with, The King's Speech. It refers to the speech, well, actually the preparations that King George VI was making. He had a terrible case of stammering. He was very uncomfortable talking in public. But as he was stepping up to the throne after his brother's abdication, right before the breaking of the Second World War, he was facing this difficulty of having to address the nation. And it was the first address which had to make a good impression. You know, you don't have a second chance for a first good impression. That was the case back then, and he was training with a, how should I call it, language therapist to be able to deliver this speech. And his speech actually coincided with the fact that his speech referred to the entrance of the United Kingdom in the Second World War in September 1939. So the pressure was not only on delivering a speech that would not be stopped by his stammering, but it was also a pressure generated by the fact that he had to talk about such a difficult topic, taking the country into a war that no one wanted. So, and his speech was televised, but mostly broadcasted on air. So again, what people heard actually had no relation to the reality. The king was stammering in general, but they heard an almost impeccable speech, which created confidence among the people, which gave them hope, which made them realize that they had someone to lead, because that was the stake of that speech. The king was supposed to send a powerful message that he was there for his people. He would take them, even if it had to be through the war, he would take them and he would lead them. And this is what people mostly generally want to hear. And the other senses that I want to discuss, what you taste depends on what you touch. And the image depicts Napoleon's campaign in Russia in 1812. There are more accurate pictures, but I wanted this one because you have the spires of a Russian church there, so I thought it would be a good indicator to see exactly what it is about. And you know, the Napoleon campaign in Russia was terrible because Napoleon stormed there and he thought it would be an easy win, but in fact he was ashamed, he had to go back ashamed with his troops decimated by typhus, by winter, by the cold, by the inappropriate of equipment. A disaster which was replicated, a sign that history repeats itself 200 years later by Hitler upon his campaign in the Soviet Union. So what you taste here is in fact defeat. It's the bitter taste of defeat. But this taste depends on what you touch. And the touch here is metaphorical, of course, but he wanted to touch on the Russian power. He wanted to destroy the Russian power, cover it, conquer it by his French power. So this interaction between the two senses led to failure, again, in his case. But this is a powerful expression, in my view, on the fact that senses and not sensibility in this great case ruled again the decision to go to a war that did not bring anything good. So the question that I'm raising is one prisoner to his senses, or are we sense dependent by choice? What I'm asking, in fact, is, are we really ruled by our senses? Are we that blindly ruled by our senses, or is it our choice to give in to our senses instead of our sensible manner? And the answer is provided mostly by the news. If you look at the news every day, and the concept, for instance, which is the CNN effect, the news carve the way we look at what is happening around us. But at the same time, we are the ones responsible for carving the news. I was telling you earlier about how we related to crisis, for instance, and I'm giving here the Romanian perspective, the Romanian view of the media on the crisis. For instance, when the pandemic started, everything was catastrophic. There were news about shortages of food and disinfectant. Everyone stormed the shops. They were actually fighting for masks. It was terrible. Then the war broke out. So the pandemic, which was the previous disaster, was somehow left in the background. We talked about the war for a year, almost a year now. However, a week ago, the earthquakes in Turkey took place. So the pandemic is far behind. No one talks about it. The war in Russia, which still troubles us, in Ukraine, sorry, the Russian aggression in Ukraine still troubles us. But again, it's somehow in the background of the news. It's secondary news, whereas everyone is talking about the earthquakes. Why? Naturally, of course, it's a disaster that has taken the toll of, I don't know, around 40,000 victims. That's the latest number that I heard. 50,000, okay, which is terrible. It is dramatic. But we also have a second reason on tackling this news. Romania has these, bless you, we have these earthquake ridges. Earthquakes are common in Romania, and even dramatic ones. We had the dramatic one in 1977 when almost a quarter of Bucharest collapsed. And again, there were many people who were killed, which led to new protocols on how to build, how to protect people from earthquakes. So we have an interior motive into looking at this earthquake and putting up all this news and gathering all this news about the earthquake. But at the same time, we're avid for news because the news broadcasters live on account of what people consume. Because we are news consumers. We want to hear what's happening. We are avid to learn if something bad is going on, and this is what the media exploits. We're also very visual persons. That's why the media is trying to use this to promote certain aspects of the news. If you read the news about an earthquake or an accident, you don't picture yourself the disaster. You don't picture the destruction. You hear there's 50,000 victims, but you can't picture yourself the number. But once you see the images, you don't have to listen to the words or, digest the words. You just see the image. You just see the image, and the image has the greatest impact of that respective news. So news is sold based on the image that it brings along, the image that influences our panic, our fears, our inner thoughts, and this is visible in our actions further in the international arena. Why? Because firstly, we act on a national level. The elections, that's the best way of sanctioning if you're not in agreement with what's happening, which is now the discussion regarding what's happening in Turkey, because there are many protests regarding the construction sites, the construction regulations used. People are angry at Erdogan, so everyone is questioning what will happen next. Then you go further, you find coalitions, you find support. Look at what Ukraine is doing right now, gathering an international support to be able to resist the war effort and continue and point out a fact. So this news, this avidity for news actually carves the amount of information that we are we are seeing. And this takes me to towards the end of my presentation, where I want to talk to you about crisis and how we relate to crisis, because all these aspects that I told you about, these are crises. And I actually have a lecture on crisis with my students, where I always tell them that you have to look at a crisis both ways. A crisis is a disaster, but it's also an opportunity. However, picturing a crisis as an opportunity needs time. You need to have the advantage of time to be able to look at it in a more relaxed manner, because once you're in a crisis, for instance, look at what is happening in Ukraine. Do you think that the people in Ukraine who are still living in basements, who are still sheltering from the bombs, who are struggling to survive and to keep sane and safe at the same time, do you think they're finding it an opportunity for them? No, of course not. I mean, if you're in such dire conditions, you're not thinking, oh, this will be an opportunity for me in the long time. However, if you look at the news and the politicians, they keep saying this is an opportunity for the Ukrainian nation. This is the time when the nation is being rebuilt. Of course, these are really nice words, and probably in a 30 years' time, 40 years' time, when we'll have enough distance from the war, this will be the reality. A new Ukrainian nation will be born, a new sense of patriotism, a new sense of approach and respect for one's nation will be built. But at the time, these people are living in dire conditions and dire situations. For them, this crisis represents probably, for some, the end of their life, or something that they perceived to be extremely dramatical for their life altogether. So it depends on how you look at this crisis, from if you point it from a sensitive or if you point it from a sensible point of view. Of course, if you're looking in an international relations perspective, that's the rhetoric. This is not an advantage, but an opportunity for the nation to grow bigger, to go stronger, to push for an expedite way of entering the international organization, joining NATO, joining the European Union. So yes, if you put it like that, and if you put it from a very distant perspective, not relating to what's happening on the ground, yes, it's an opportunity. But at the same time, if you're putting it from a sensitive point of view, you cannot be reluctant to understand that what is happening on the ground is little an opportunity, but in fact a form of major destruction, that it's affecting people, that it's affecting generations, that it's affecting the manner in which these people can actually build the nation that we're all hoping for. So the solutions and the effects and the way we look at these actually depend on emotion and reason alike. But of course, you have to look at where you sit when you refer to this aspect. And finally, because I'm running out of time, my conclusions go back to the story of Jane Austen. I'm sure you know the story. It's the three sisters whose father dies, and they are left just with their mother, and in very dramatic economic conditions. They need to fight the prejudices of the time, and two of them are actually also fighting their feelings. One of them is very sensible, and she resignates herself with the fact that she won't find an appropriate match because of her state. She doesn't have a dowry, whereas the other is a dreamer, and she keeps dreaming that she will find the perfect man for her, she will fall in love, and she will be happy for the rest of her life. Jane Austen, although she starts this book in a very, how should I say, disbalanced manner, because of talking of these prejudices, she ends it in a happy end, because both sisters marry the people they love. So, but going back to the two terms, sense and sensibility, in every one of us, be it a decision maker or an individual, there is a sensible, in this case Eleanor, she was the sensible, and a sensitive Marianne. And it depends on on each of us which of these two girls, which of these two characters comes out at the right moment. Because there are moments in life when you need to be sensible, and there are moments when you need to be sensitive. It all depends on how you relate to these moments, and you acknowledge that this is the time to be sensible and to be sensitive. And this is true because international relations, leaving aside the theoretical aspect, is in fact a representation of interhuman relations. If you look at realism, for instance, states are driven by raison d'etat, the state interest. We all have personal interests which drive us and our actions. So international relations are just the upper level, the macroscopic level of interhuman relations, which are affected greatly by our senses, and our actions are a depiction of those senses. And the important thing with which I want to end my presentation is that we need to acknowledge the fact that we're both sense and sensibility. We need to understand that even if we place people in higher positions or decision makers, they will be also run by their feelings. Just a brief example, if you look at the correspondence between the Tsar, the Kaiser, and the head of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy before the outbreak of the First World War, you will see a lot of emotion there, especially in the correspondence between the Kaiser and the Tsar, who are cousins. So you will find emotion, and mostly, if you leave aside the Sarajevo attempt and all the geopolitical explanations, the fact that the war broke out was on account of fears and despair on both sides. So the sooner we learn this, the better. And this is especially important for students who are now training and learning international relations, who are hoping to become diplomats or statesmen or decision makers, and to whom I wish they all enter these positions, because they are incredible positions, and one learns a lot from being in such a position. But they need to learn that the theory that we're all teaching in school and the theory that everyone is urging us to respect is in fact marred by these senses, which are personal and which we cannot leave aside or ignore. And it's highly important not to even try to do that. Thank you.